Okay, then let's start. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining my session here. I'm Gasper Andrejc. I'm from Slovenia. I'm a co-author of something called FHIR Connect that I will dedicate this talk today to. For the past 10 years of my career in health IT, I have been working mostly with FHIR, but lately, primarily due to a push coming from the industry and from the projects that I've been working at, also into something called openEHR. So what are the problems that we will be addressing in this session, or the problems that I see stakeholders addressing when they're looking or piloting openEHR? It's the fact that most of them know that going purely openEHR is never going to solve their problems. They cannot get rid of FHIR. It is just too widely used to adopt it. It is doing too many things the right way. And you want to be compliant with national IGs and national tenders, the European tenders that are coming out as well, and therefore getting rid of FHIR is never really the answer. And when implementing openEHR or when implementing FHIR, it shouldn't be a question of one or the other. You should really be able to use the best of both and really use them for the purpose that they were created for. And FHIR, as seen by many, is a standard for exchange. It may not necessarily be the best for persistence, for storing clinical data, but it is, and it was created for exchange. On the other side, openEHR, which some may see as preferred for storage of clinical data, is kind of bad for innovation, for exchange, for supporting use cases on top. One was created for developers by developers, and the other one was created more with clinicians in mind and more with the idea of really supporting every possible use case out there. So if we are drawing parallels with FHIR, with the 80-20 rule, the openEHR really is there to support 100% of all possible use cases. And as such, the granularity, the complexity is kind of built in. But both of these approaches come at a cost. The FHIR, the one modeled for developers by developers, offers a really easy framework, a framework that, as you all know, you can really achieve something and do quick, but at the same time, you can do something quick and dirty. You can take shortcuts, you can do something that you may not be the proudest looking back at it 5 years afterwards. On the other hand, the openEHR one is so complex and so granular that it kind of arguably hinders innovation, and there are very little openEHR native applications on top of openEHR because it's very hard to grasp, it's very complex, and contrary to FHIR, it's quite hard for developers to understand and to work with. So what are we seeing now? We are seeing these two separate islands, two separate data flows. So stakeholders looking into openEHR are forced to have two separate islands of data, the openEHR one, the one that they're seeing as really future-proof clinical data repository, something that is, as mentioned, properly modeled by clinicians, use case agnostic, vendor agnostic, something that should stand the test of time, and something they see as the one that they would like to set up their data strategy with, the data-centric data strategy. The other flow that they are forced to have is the FHIR one, the FHIR data flow, because as mentioned, they want to be compliant to various different IGs, the EHDS, the IPS, the BGZ, so definitely they have to have FHIR there as well if they want to drive innovation and if they want to have applications and use cases on top of their data. And right now, because there is nothing in between them through which they would be able to provide a holistic overview of all data, these are the two separate islands that they have to have and two separate data flows with nothing in between. Basically, they have to either duplicate data or have them for different use cases. They could definitely, and some do, throw money at the problem. They could implement some integration engine that would be very use case specific. Mappings would be written in code, would be written by developers, would not be scalable, would not be maintainable. Every mapping that you would do, you would need to get a developer to do it for you. And for every other use case that you would build from that single one, it would be a new integration project altogether. So really something that would take lots of money, and every use case that you would implement, you wouldn't be able to reuse it when scaling up to other use cases. So yeah, knowing all of that and knowing the problems, the different islands of data, and at the same time, the pitfalls of FHIR, so the variety of different FHIR IGs and profiles that are coming out, How can a stakeholder or some architect really come up with a data strategy that would be patient or data-centric, research-driven, educational-focused, interoperable, but at the same time really stand the test of time so that they would be able to sleep at night knowing that they have created something for the, I don't know, 20, 30 years. What with all the IGs coming out, well, on a monthly basis, let's say. So enter, well, FHIR Connect. FHIR Connect is a specification, so it is not an integration engine, it's a specification, an open source one for expressing bidirectional mappings between openEHR and FHIR. It was actually started a couple of years ago by someone from a company called Better, but at that point in time, maybe because the openEHR and FHIR at that point in time were still seen as kind of competitor standards rather than complementary ones, it really was not picked up. And it was not tested, it was not validated, and as such, it didn't really live to its potential. But then last year, myself, people from HiMed and people from MedBlocks joined forces and started working on that foundation that was laid out by Better. And on a couple of use cases, we created something that we think is really granular, is, well, more reusable, so that it's easy to scale up from use cases. It leverages concepts that are known to these two communities. So on one hand side, FHIRPad and AQLPad. And yeah, we think that because it is open source and because of the concepts that I will describe in the next slides, it really is something that the industry needs and the industry can leverage when working out a hybrid architecture of both openEHR and FHIR. What are the concepts that we think are the best for FHIRConnect for such a standard? Co-founder of FHIRConnect, so Severin Kohler from HiMed, is an openEHR International member of the spec and is working both on getting this spec approved by openEHR International as well as mappings to be really present there in the clinical knowledge manager. Basically, if you look at it like a simplifier for openEHR. So the mappings that are archetype centric, so they're written per archetype, would be there in the CQM right next to the archetype that they are mapping in the first place. As mentioned, the spec is open source. There is nothing in the spec that would tie it to any specific vendor. Mappings that you create, you can take to any other engine that implements the FHIRConnect, and it should be able to execute it. So it is really some open source spec, just like FHIR or just like openEHR is open source. As mentioned, mappings are bidirectional, meaning a single mapping you use when executing both openEHR to FHIR and FHIR to openEHR. But it's important to note that this is really mapping data instances, so really composition to not resources, but in some cases less than resource, so composition to FHIR data type and vice versa. There already is a public library of mappings. It's on GitHub, so apart from those approved ones landing in the CQM, there already is a library available where people can share those mappings. So if you create a mapping, the idea is that you share it with the rest of the community and other people can use that mapping if they're supporting or if they're using the same archetype that you have used in your templates. Perhaps the best thing of it all is the fact that it is modular. So if you're familiar a bit with openEHR, you know that in openEHR you have archetypes, and those archetypes are use case agnostic. They are not use case by themselves. But when you combine archetypes into a template, this becomes a use case. But the same archetype can be used in many different templates. And because a mapping, a FHIRConnect mapping, is for a specific archetype, the FHIRConnect mapping can be reused as well. Meaning that if you create a mapping of a specific use case for an archetype, and you reuse that archetype, you basically reuse the mapping as well. And because of that, it's very easier to scale up and faster to scale up to other use cases if you're reusing the work that you've done. It is not uncommon to modify an archetype that you have found in publicly available CKM, and it would be bad if you then needed to do a whole mapping yet again because you have modified just a tiny piece of the archetype. So extensibility is basically built in the standard so that you can extend just the thing that you have modified in the archetype in the first place. Now, all of this comes with a bit of a learning curve, and we know FHIR is not the easiest. openEHR is definitely not the easiest. It's quite complex, one of the pitfalls, in my opinion, of openEHR. And this is yet another thing that we're adding now. So the FHIRConnect is yet another thing that someone has to learn, that someone has to grasp. And I think the major risk of this standard is the fact that it would be, because it's yet another thing, it would be hard to grasp and therefore maybe not be adopted. But there are a couple of mitigating factors. As mentioned, it leverages existing concepts. So it leverages FHIR on one hand side, and it leverages AQL on the other side. And other than that, it really is just a couple of other details that you have to get to know with FHIR Connect, a couple of things of how recurrence works and how nesting works. But really, if you know the AQL and the FHIR, you should be able to get on board quite quickly, especially considering the fact that there also are tools out there available to both simplify the writing of the mapping itself, as well as navigating through those mappings. One such tool being an IntelliJ plugin called FHIRConnect that really helps this a lot. So how does all of this come together and what you're able to get with it? If we remember this picture from before with two separate islands of data, now you can have this. So you can have, at the bottom, you can have the single source of truth, openEHR clinical data repository, something that is properly modeled by clinicians, is use case agnostic, is profile agnostic. So whatever you do down there, it's something that you do for 30 years, let's say. At the top, you have FHIR facade, something that you're building use cases on top, something through which you're being compliant with various different profiles and IGs. Also something like openEHR, vendor agnostic, and based on open source standard. And in the middle, the thing that really enables this architecture in the first place is the FHIR Connect, which too is open source, the spec itself being open source, and vendor agnostic, meaning that you have basically achieved a fully vendor agnostic architecture based on open standards. And with that in mind, we are also achieving this, and this may be the best selling point of this architecture, and it is the fact that, as mentioned, you have the single source of truth, the openEHR clinical data repository, and then through FHIR Connect, you're able to expose that data with various different profiles purely with the help of FHIR Connect. So you're really not taking any compromises or changing anything in your single source of truth in openEHR CDR just to comply to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 profiles that are coming up. And so if in Netherlands you wanted to support international patient summary, BGZ, European patient summary, and what have you, that's going to come, you would not be taking any compromises on the properly modeled clinical data repository modeled with openEHR, which is what it was meant to do. Now, very quickly, openFHIR is just one such engine that is implementing FHIRConnect. The two architecture or the two ways of how a FHIR native app would be interacting with such an architecture that we've seen before. So, for example, you have a FHIR native app that is producing data, for example, remote patient monitoring or questionnaires or whatever. That FHIR native application is sending resources to your FHIR facade. FHIR facade is invoking, for example, openFHIR that leverages FHIRConnect to map the composition, and that composition is stored in your openEHR CDR. Alternatively, if a FHIR native app wants to query your data, the query goes through a FHIR facade. FHIR facade is exposing that data compliant to profiles, to implementation guide, and the composition that has been found in openEHR CDR is mapped to a FHIR resource before returned to the consumer. So basically, FHIR native apps, the point is that FHIR native apps are not affected by the fact that you have openEHR CDR there underneath and that is your data strategy. They're communicating just with the FHIR facade and with the FHIR profile that you're exposing on that FHIR facade. There is a very strict separation of concern when it comes to openFHIR. By itself, it does not expose a FHIR-compliant API, and nor does it have any openEHR CDR within itself. So it's not storing clinical data, it's just mapping, and it's just a mapping component. It's not there to replace a FHIR server, and it's not there to replace an openEHR CDR. It is there just a minimalistic mapping engine that implements FHIRConnect. The openFHIR Atlas is a UI on this technical component and is one of the tools that we think should help with the adoption, because it really is that you're able to visualize the mappings that you have created and that otherwise are in YAML files, as well as really see how the mapping execution happened. How to get started? So there is a publicly available sandbox. You can also install it locally in Docker. There's also documentation, and actually the whole source of openFHIR has been open sourced by a company called Madblocks. You can reach me on LinkedIn, on this mail, but you can also reach the other author of FHIR Connect, which as mentioned is Severin Kohler from Germany. How much time do we have? I can also do it. Sorry? 5 minutes. Okay, then just a quick demo and then we go to the questions. Oh man. Where's the mouse? I'm gonna have to do this. Yeah, not that much. Okay, so here we have, for example, an openEHR template, which is blood pressure, and it has one archetype in it, just for the purpose of this demo. And here you have the two concepts that I've talked about before. So on one hand side, you have FHIR pet pinpoint a data element in FHIR, and on the other hand side, you have the AQL pet pinpointing a data point in openEHR archetype. Of course, there are a couple of conditions. So for this case, if a component is of code that lowing, that's actually systolic, etc. So this is nothing else than visualization of that YAML file. And then if we go to the actual execution, so you can load an example. This is openEHR composition, and it maps to, well, a FHIR bundle in this case. And if you go the other way around, you're mapping a FHIR bundle to composition. And then in Insights, you can actually see how the mapping took place, so which part of the mapping file were actually used in execution and really what data elements were there mapped from one to the other. Okay. And then that would be it from my side. Happy to take questions.
Thanks, thanks, Gasper. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Are there any? Yeah, I see here.
And going from openEHR to FHIR, have you done anything of saying, okay, here's an archetype or a template, let's represent it as a logical model in FHIR, or is it just, is that any consideration of doing that? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a valid question and a valid requirement out there as well. And I think within the FHIR Connect itself, there is enough information to do that. So really being able to, from template, create even profiles, that would be the next step, yeah. And we have seen that already. The 2 requests came in already, and you're the 3rd, so.
Hi, and with multi-versioning, how do you address that?
Right now, this is only R4. So, but the thing is that because existing concepts are used, the FHIR path, for example, when pinpointing and when creating data instances, it really is version agnostic, so to say. Of course, there are things that we would need to implement in this case, openFHIR engine, and it would then be a different API that you would have to invoke when mapping a different version. But really, it is in the implementation itself, there is nothing tying you to a specific version, nor in the spec if we're talking about FHIRConnect.
There you go.
I have no experience with openEHR, but how do you map terminology, and should it be mapped,
Yes,
or is it one-to-one?
It definitely should be mapped, and is one of the things that is a pain. So in the spec itself, there is mention of how this should be done. What openFHIR does, which is the engine, is that you're able to integrate with an external terminology server, but that terminology server should be FHIR IG compliant to the terminology. So you're able to map one and the other, but it's definitely one of the things that we had to implement at the very beginning, because openEHR terminology is a lot less developed than the FHIR one, let's call it like that. Also, one of the things that I think is going to be the soonest of where HR7 and openEHR are going to collaborate on.
Okay, unfortunately, we run out of time. So let's thank you very much, Gasper. If you have any questions, Gasper will be here the entire dev day, so you will find him. And don't forget to provide your feedback. That's very valuable for us. So thanks, everyone.